Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
A regular babysitter or helping a husband find his cheating wife? Today's story with a subplot. Enjoy the show! From the very beginning, I thought this was a very bad idea, but I had to try something, anything, despite being convinced I was wasting my time and everyone else's. Bill Gillard, my boss, heard about the job opening and insisted that I apply. Bill knew, as did I, that I would need far more money in my bank account than he could ever pay me if I had any chance of winning the custody case. I needed a lot more just to cover all the legal fees, not to mention hiring someone to look after the kids during the day while I worked, if, by some miracle, I emerged victorious in court. Interviews have never been my strong suit, and I doubted many others enjoyed them either. I cleared the preliminary stages without much difficulty and was shortlisted. However, this particular interview, where Jack Goldberg himself would be in attendance, was one I wasn't really looking forward to. You see, Jack and I had a history of sorts. To be honest, I had a brief relationship with his daughter, Canella, known to most as Ella or Ellie, during our teenage years. My family did not approve of my relationship with a Jewish girl, regardless of how beautiful she was or how nice her car was. My parents weren't anti-Semitic, but they were very conscious of social class. My father had a particular issue with people he deemed privileged, while Ellie's family felt similarly about anyone they thought didn't come from the right background. I wouldn't be surprised if they were aware of my Christian upbringing, even if I didn't attend church regularly. In truth, I'm not sure that religion played a significant role in the Goldbergs' perspective. It seemed that unless someone attended private school, they would never be considered suitable. My father believed that those educated in the private sector should be held to a high standard, while the Goldbergs viewed public education as inferior. The old Triumph I rode, along with my leather jacket, jeans, and boots, evoked a strong reaction from the Goldbergs and from most of the parents of the girls I dated back then. They never saw me in the business suit I wore at the office. Perhaps that's why I dressed in leather and rode a motorcycle. I was young and wanted to project a rebellious image. Most of my friends were still in college and didn't have to adhere to an office dress code. Ellie and I had a really good time together for quite a while. I faced a lot of teasing from my friends, with snide remarks about how I was only dating Ellie because of the brand new car her dad had given her for her birthday. Like many young people, I couldn't afford a car at that time. Plus, even in the depths of winter, there were places to park and things to do in a car that you couldn't do on an old Triumph. I'll admit that the car played a role in shaping our relationship, but the biggest draw for me was that Ellie was stunning by any standard. To be honest, I initially started flirting with her partly because of a rumor among my friends that she wouldn't date just anyone. I felt the need to prove that I was someone who could attract any woman I wanted. However, once I took the plunge and started dating her, I found myself truly enjoying our time together. At first, I didn't take our relationship seriously. I was young and didn't take much seriously back then. I began to wonder if Ellie was dating me just to counter those rumors about her being a snob. Over time, though, I became attached to her and mistakenly believed she felt the same way about me, despite our family's disapproval and the teasing I received from my friends. Ellie and I were together for almost 2 years before her father sent her off to what she called school, though I always suspected it was more like a finishing school. In my opinion, the Goldbergs had a tendency toward delusions of grandeur, and I didn't fit their mold. The Goldbergs have always had delusions of grandeur anyway. I wasn't much of a letter writer back then, and although I was more than a little upset that Ellie had left, I figured there were plenty of other opportunities out there. I assumed Ellie was too busy studying, so after the initial impulse, our letters became less frequent until they stopped altogether. Eventually, I realized Ellie just wanted to enjoy her time with friends, as some girls do. I quickly discovered that I hadn't lost my charm, and I developed an interesting reputation among the local girls. There must have been some reason for my success in connecting with them. I may have been lucky, but I never thought of myself as a smooth talker. While I never found out exactly what the girls were saying about me behind my back, it was clear that it didn't hurt my chances with other girls. Some new friends made it known that they would be available if I showed interest, which didn't sit well with some of the other guys and sometimes led to awkward situations that affected not only budding romances but also my friendships. If a girl made it clear she was interested, who was I to refuse? After Ellie left, I developed a habit of dating frequently, partly because I could and partly because I had become quite attached to Ellie. Losing her was unexpectedly painful, and I wasn't going to fall into that emotional trap again. It was 3 or 4 years before I started dating Gloria. I can't quite remember where we met, maybe at a party. She was and remains a remarkably beautiful woman, and her appearance likely played a role in how our relationship began. I can't recall the details of our first date, but Gloria and I clicked quickly. I think it was on our 4th or 5th date. We both had some experience by then, as most young people do. By that time, I had moved on from my old motorcycle to my own car, which made getting to work in a suit much easier. After about 5 or 6 months, one of the guys mentioned that Gloria had been around longer than usual compared to my previous girlfriends. I hadn't really noticed it at the time, and I wasn't sure if it was good or bad. Against my better judgment, I had somehow grown accustomed to having Gloria around. Was I in love with her? To be honest, I can't say for certain what I felt at the time, despite Gloria's more apparent flaws. Like Ellie, Gloria came from a family with grand ambitions, but while Ellie turned out to be quite different, Gloria was more costly to maintain. She was an exciting companion but had a tendency to spend money freely. By the time I realized this significant flaw, I had grown so accustomed to Gloria being part of my life that I couldn't imagine it without her. We had been dating for just over 2 years when I must have proposed to her. I don't remember the first time I asked Gloria to marry me, but I do recall a party later on where I formally gave her an engagement ring. By then, it was a done deal, and no one was surprised. We got married within a year of that party, and soon after, Pamela, our first child, was on the way. Unlike many of our young married friends, we didn't have financial troubles at first. Although I wasn't a particularly gifted student and left school earlier than most, Mrs. Williams, my math teacher, referred me to the accounting department of a local company, and I guess she used some influence to help me get the job. My interest in computers and programming may have played a role, but I don't think it was significant. I was fortunate to have Bill Gillard, the company's accountant and a friend of Mrs. Williams, take a liking to me. He sent me to a full-time accounting course at a local technical college, where I found many of my classmates were older. Surprisingly, some even asked me to be their study partner. My talent for math turned out to be greater than I realized. As a result, within a few years, I became number 2 in the accounting department, working under Bill and receiving valuable mentorship. I was never short of money in my early 20s, but my social lifestyle meant I spent money almost as quickly as I earned it. This might explain why I didn't notice Gloria's spending habits while we were dating. After she gave birth to our second daughter, things began to change. Gloria's desire for a more extravagant lifestyle became evident, and after Deborah joined the family, her expectations grew. Gloria, although a housewife, insisted on hiring help to care for the girls, which I thought we couldn't afford. This led to significant tension at home. Gloria had been expressing her feelings about being at home since Pamela was born, but I attributed it to the challenges of new motherhood. It wasn't until Deborah arrived that things came to a head. Eventually, Gloria suggested returning to work, at least part-time, to help pay for a nanny. This seemed like a reasonable solution, and for a while, we navigated the process of finding a nanny, filling out forms, and welcoming Inga, our young Swedish nanny, into the home. Gloria resumed her job at the company she worked for before Pamela was born. The girls took an immediate liking to Inga, who seemed to adore them in return. I never heard Inga complain as Gloria often did about the demands of motherhood. Some evenings, Inga would spend hours quietly singing to the children until they fell asleep. I got along great with Inga, what man wouldn't? She was undeniably attractive, embodying the classic Swedish beauty we often see in films. Her presence added a lighthearted energy to the family, and her English improved remarkably in just a few weeks with us. It was amusing to watch how young men, and even some grown men who should have known better, got distracted by her. I saw one guy ride his bike into a bus, and another flip over his skateboard, all because their attention was on Inga rather than where they were going. However, there was a more serious side to Inga's presence. After a few months, she privately mentioned that she often had to look after the children longer than her contract stated, even though her hours were similar to what Gloria worked. Inga seemed happy to help most evenings, but her comments hinted at something deeper. She suggested that Gloria sometimes got in and out of a strange car on her way to and from work. Initially, I wasn't bothered by this since Gloria had mentioned carpooling with a friend from her old job, but Inga's hints about this friend's changing gender and vehicle access piqued my concern. Inga confided that her mother had cheated on her father when she was young, and she felt compelled to tell me that she suspected Gloria might be doing the same. After taking a few days off, I became convinced that Gloria was having an affair with one of her office managers. When I confronted her, she seemed unfazed and dismissed my concerns, calling me cheap and boring. She then informed me she would be moving in with her new boyfriend, taking the children and Inga with her. Surprisingly, Gloria and the kids moved in with him the very next day, but Inga didn't go with them. The nanny agency transferred Inga to another family that same day, but she often came to visit me, usually bringing along a friend, Agda, another Swedish nanny and apparently Inga's best friend in the UK. I wouldn't want anyone to think I simply stood there in shock during my confrontation with Gloria. On the contrary, I engaged with her fully. I was prepared with the typical responses you'd expect in such a situation. Gloria's main point of contention seemed to be that she didn't think I earned enough to support the lifestyle she desired. Surprisingly, she didn't criticize my performance in bed, which I had expected given that it's often a go-to tactic in these scenarios. Much later, Gloria would bring this up, but for now, it was clear she had her own agenda. I was understandably upset, and while things could have escalated, Inga had specifically advised me to stay calm and not let emotions take control. I knew all too well how situations could spiral out of hand. Inga's father had lost his temper in a similar situation, leading to serious consequences and a criminal record that affected his custody battle. The divorce process was confusing and lengthy, mainly because I was determined that my kids wouldn't end up living with someone who had been unfaithful to me for who knows how long. Gloria, too, was fighting for custody and at one point even tried to convince the court that the girls weren't mine. However, the court didn't take her claims at face value and ordered DNA tests. It made me wonder just how long Gloria had been involved with this man, which didn't do much for my self-esteem. In the end, her attempts to deceive the court might have backfired on her. Judges typically don't appreciate being misled. The custody battle was still ongoing the day of my interview, which turned out to be extremely costly. This was one reason I needed a higher salary, to cover the expenses of all these legal challenges. There's a general consensus in the UK that a mother is often seen as the best person to raise children. Of course, this is provided she isn't struggling with addiction or if the father isn't significantly more financially stable. I knew it was a long road, which is why I found myself at that interview, encouraged by my current boss, Bill Gillard. He suggested I apply for a position with a much higher salary than he could offer. 5 of us were shortlisted for 2 positions, accounting department manager and assistant. Bill had shared some unofficial information with me, hinting that the previous employees in these roles had left under questionable circumstances, financing their exit at the company's expense. We gathered at Goldberg & Sons' office at 10 o'clock that morning, left to wait in a reception area, cared for by Jill Sampson. She was pleasant and attractive, and her presence added a certain dynamic to the atmosphere. The interview panel eventually arrived, consisting of the director of accounting, the HR manager, and Jack Goldberg himself. I was concerned that Jack would dismiss me as a candidate once he realized who I was. As they entered, they barely acknowledged us, and while Jill greeted them warmly, I felt a knot of apprehension in my stomach. Jack gave me a quick glance before the 3 of them headed into the conference room, closing the door behind them. An eternity seemed to pass while the HR manager emerged briefly for a quiet conversation with Jill, glancing in my direction. At that moment, I felt the weight of the day slipping away. A buzzer on Jill's desk signaled the start of the interviews, and she called in the first candidate. I couldn't help but wonder what they could possibly discuss for so long during this final round. A nervous candidate tried to make conversation with the rest of us, and only I responded. I think he was just trying to be friendly. I was mostly focused on making Bill proud. He had always been like a second father to me, and I knew he would be disappointed if I didn't see this through. The second candidate was in and out in about 10 minutes, looking defeated as he left. The third candidate, however, entered with an air of confidence that suggested he already felt assured of the job. When the third candidate emerged after a solid 40 minutes, he had a confident expression, like a cat that had just found its prize. He looked like a man who knew he had the job locked down. The secretary then called Varia in, smiling sweetly at me before disappearing behind the large oak door. For a brief moment, I found myself wishing I wouldn't get the job. I could sense the HR manager's keen interest in her. Having seen the way he looked at her during the previous interviews, I had a feeling he wouldn't let her leave easily. 20 minutes later, Virya returned, her smile indicating she would likely be joining the Goldberg staff, pending reference checks. Strangely, she smiled at me again and said, "See you soon," which made me realize she might think I'd be looking for her around town. I wasn't wearing my wedding ring anymore, and I noticed she wasn't wearing any rings either. "Graham, focus on why you're here," a small voice reminded me as she walked down the hallway. But another part of me thought this was a complete waste of time. I might as well get something out of the day. Just then, Jill Sampson called me in, interrupting my thoughts. The HR manager sat in the center, with the accounting director on his right and Jack Goldberg on his left, positioned further from the table. The HR manager asked the questions while Goldberg regarded me as if I had just fallen from another planet. The questions were predictable. I had answered most of them in my application or earlier interviews. Yet, I could feel Jack's intense gaze on me. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Spark, your face seems very familiar. Have we met somewhere before?" I took a deep breath, recalling my past with Kella. "Yes, Mr. Goldberg, we dated a few years ago." He leaned back, squinting, as if trying to remember. Just then, Jerry Hartwell, the HR manager, approached, casting a shadow over the table. "Mr. Spark, it's nice to see you both getting to know each other. May I join you?" Without waiting for a response, he sat next to Virya and placed an envelope in front of her. "Your formal invitation to join the company staff for the position we discussed." Turning to me, he continued, "Mr. Spark, may I call you Graham?" I nodded. "Our meeting here is fortunate. I need to apologize for Mr. Goldberg's earlier surprise. He usually keeps his personal life separate from work, but your presence today caught him off guard. Jack sincerely regrets if he inadvertently suggested any connection between you and what some people might consider a dubious group. He didn't realize you would be sensitive about it, but you probably know more than he does." To be honest, I didn't fully grasp what Hartwell meant until it clicked. They thought I had withdrawn from the interview because Goldberg implied I was associated with the Hells Angels. Despite the unfortunate misunderstanding, which William Gillard assures us is out of character for Jack, we would still like to offer you the position of department manager, with Virya as your deputy. He then placed another envelope in front of me. Virya began to open her envelope, but Jerry Hartwell gently placed his hand on her arm before she could see its contents. "I think it's important to explain why these two positions became vacant," he said. "If you accept the offer, you should know that you will both be under close scrutiny for a while. I wanted all candidates to be informed of this from the start, but I was persuaded not to." He continued, "Previous employees in these roles falsified records together. Both were married and had been involved in an inappropriate relationship for several years. They absconded with a significant portion of the company's annual turnover, leaving Jack in a precarious position that required him to invest heavily to keep the company afloat. Surely, the accountant must have noticed something amiss, right?" "You'd think so," I replied. "The accounts ended up significantly overdrawn. Unfortunately, the director in charge had been ill for most of the last year, and the person in your position filled in temporarily, which created an opportunity to exploit the system. He vanished after draining the company dry in just 7 months, taking his partner with him." "Exactly," Virya chimed in. "They were last seen boarding a ferry to Denmark, and after that, their whereabouts are unknown. The police classified everything because not just Goldberg and Sons were at risk, but all of Jack's other businesses as well. He had to borrow substantial amounts from them to stabilize the situation. I mention this because your daily work will be closely monitored for a while. All candidates were vetted, and I believe that's why Jack was surprised to discover your identity," Hartwell explained. "By the way, Jack has been completely absent from the hiring process for reasons that will become clear. His assumption that anyone who rode a motorcycle was connected to a gang led to his initial reaction." "Were they concerned about my relationship with Ellie?" I asked. "No, I think Jack learned his lesson about interfering with personal matters. His wife, however, may still be involved in some capacity, but Canella seems to blame her parents for everything. Now, she's handling things on her own." "What happened?" I inquired. "Sorry, Graham, but I don't think it's my place to discuss Canella's issues, especially now. Whether Hartwell intended to intrigue me or not, he succeeded. He was hinting at something, and I wanted to know more. What are these circumstances? I asked. For a moment, Hartwell looked embarrassed, as if he had revealed too much, but he quickly regained his composure. Well, if you ever courted Canella, I guess Jack and Mrs. Goldberg didn't approve, Hartwell smiled. You can bet they didn't, I replied with a grin. But how do you know? Something made you leave that interview in a hurry. If it wasn't Jack's remark about the Hells Angels, then what else could it be? Let's just say that Jack has learned not to interfere in Canella's love life again, and I suspect he'll avoid mixing family and business in the future. You have me confused, Mr. Hartwell. Graham, if you accept the offer, I'm sure you'll understand the situation soon enough. It's not my role to share personal details. I'll leave you and Viria to review your proposals. Please let us know your decision tomorrow morning. As Hartwell left, Viria turned to me. Well, open it. Look, Graham, if you don't take this job, then I won't either. I refuse to work with that arrogant jerk, no matter how much money is involved. I opened the letter and skimmed through it until I reached the financial section. The number shocked me, leaving me staring at the page with my mouth agape. Earth to Major Tom. Viria said, pulling me back to reality. Jesus Christ, I muttered. But remember, this is only a 3-month contract to start with, right? That's what you're looking at, Viria continued. Our contracts are only for 3 months initially. I suspect they're hedging their bets after, well, you know what I mean. I realized then that while Viria had opened her proposal, she hadn't actually read it. She was holding the letter as if she were looking through it, but her eyes were focused on my face as I read mine. I only noticed this later, when Bill Gillard mentioned that the director in charge of the Goldberg accounts was on loan from a local accounting firm. Suddenly, I remembered Viria had mentioned working for a local accounting company, but I couldn't recall the name. Bill was still talking about the great opportunity Goldberg was offering me, assuring me that if things didn't work out, there would always be a place for me in the department. When I asked him if he'd heard of Viria Poole, he seemed to know every accountant within a 50-mile radius. Of course. I think this must be Reggie Poole's daughter. There can't be too many Virias around. Reggie's one of the partners at Fakes, Bill said with a smile. If she's the one set to be your assistant, then you're in luck. Reggie says she really knows her stuff. Yes, it must be her. It seems I've been followed from the very beginning, I replied, perhaps a bit too sharply. Hey, wait, Graham, don't get mad. I know Reggie thinks Viria will go far, but for obvious reasons, he can't give her an unfair advantage. That would leave room for other partners to do the same, and let's just say some wouldn't last long here. What you need to remember is that after their last fiasco, Goldberg and Sons are looking for absolute honesty. When they asked for my advice, I suggested you, and they probably did the same with Reggie. Someone there must have thought of Viria, too. You were both chosen because you hadn't met before, and maybe to keep an eye on each other. Before I could respond, Inga and Agda entered through the front door. Ina never returned the house key, and for some reason, I hadn't thought to ask for it. Perhaps it was because Inga often came over during the day to clean and do my laundry. She was also an excellent cook. I never dared to stop for a drink on the way home from the office, just in case they were preparing something delicious in the kitchen. I'm not a chef, never have been, which is why Ina and Agda made sure I had good home-cooked meals several evenings each week. Of course, none of the girls were particularly happy with the families they worked for at the time. They often showed up at my house with potential boyfriends, and I think my opinion determined whether those guys got a second date. I realized I was getting lost in details again. Anyway, Ina was enthusiastic about my job offer. She understood my situation with custody of the children and encouraged me to keep fighting. Deciding to accept Goldberg's offer, I invited both girls to a nice dinner to celebrate. Unfortunately, this angered their employers because I brought them home well after midnight. Their parents complained to the nanny agency, which scolded both girls and informed their families. Oddly enough, this didn't have the desired effect. I had met Ina's father several times when she worked for me, and he viewed me as reliable. He apparently knew Agda's parents well, and so the agency was told not to meddle in our affairs. In the end, both Ina and Agda left the agency altogether, but that's a story for another time. Taking the job was an easy decision since I needed the extra money. The next morning, I called Jerry Hartwell to formally accept the offer. The substantial salary increase was exactly what I needed to continue my custody fight. Strangely, Jerry Hartwell had shown great interest in my court case early on. Looking back, I wasn't sure whether to place importance on his interest in my personal problems, but it was reassuring when he assured me that once registered with the company, they would provide me with maximum moral support. He explained the company's flexible work schedule, designed to help single parents, and noted that this flexibility extended to single fathers, too. My first few days at Goldberg were challenging. Virya and I had to navigate the complex and understand how the company operated within the accounting department. We often speculated whether any of the employees had been involved in the misconduct of our predecessors. Although no evidence linked them, we couldn't shake the feeling that some employees made us uneasy. Considering the history of this department, there were a few staff members with whom Virya and I never felt comfortable. Most of them left over the next 6 months or so. One lunchtime, Jack Goldberg caught up with us shortly after we started and insisted on taking us to lunch with Jerry Hartwell and several other board members. There was no mention of Ellie or the unpleasant scene at the interview. Jack simply wanted to know how we were getting along. The rest of the lunch conversation was minor, except for Jerry Hartwell quietly asking how my legal battles were progressing as we walked back to the office. After a couple of weeks, things became routine. Everyone seemed to know their roles, and once Virya and I got acquainted with our responsibilities, the days settled into a monotonous rhythm. Then, about 5 or 6 weeks after we started, Virya burst into my office with 2 cups of coffee. This was her usual way of signaling that she wanted to discuss something or had heard a harmless office rumor. "Graham, do you know who Roger Surge, the guy you replaced, was?" she asked, handing me a cup and settling into her usual chair. "No, I've never heard of him," I replied, which was true. I only knew about him because Bill Gillard had mentioned that he falsified the books at Goldberg and made off with a significant amount of money. Oh my God. Everyone kept that a secret. Wouldn't you? I joked. Fortunately, Virya and I had developed a good rapport, allowing for some light teasing. However, I sensed her concern. This is serious. It's not fair. I think they should have told you this before offering you the position. Her expression made it clear that whatever she had heard was significant. What about Roger Surge and Goldberg? I asked. What's the scoop? Okay, you asked for it. Your old girlfriend, Canella Goldberg, well, for the last 6 or 7 years, her name has been Mrs. Canella Surge. Are you kidding? No, really. Roger Surge was old man Goldberg's son-in-law, which makes him your old girlfriend's husband. Holy God, I replied, taken aback. That's probably why they didn't pursue him after the CFO had a heart attack. They assumed there was no need to keep an eye on him since he was family. Oh my God, poor Ellie. But that's not all. Rumor has it Canella only married him because her parents thought he was suitable. That kind of explains why Goldberg tried to stay out of your employment situation, doesn't it? Roger Surge was Jack Goldberg's golden boy. Why would he risk running off with all that money when he had access to all of Goldberg's millions? Maybe Canella realized he was secretly dating his assistant. Did Ellie know about the affair? I don't know if she knew with whom, but some believe Canella suspected something was up. She started showing up at the office unexpectedly, always bringing her children. The consensus was that she was trying to awaken his conscience. And they didn't take the hint? I asked, incredulous. I suspect Roger decided to lay low and accumulate as much money as possible before making a run for it, especially if Canella found out and threw him out. Poor Jack. Why do you sympathize with him? Maybe he thought his money could buy his daughter a good husband. More like a husband with bad manners. Have you seen Surge's personal file? No, and you? Well, there's an illegal copy floating around. Most of the employees thought they were about to lose their jobs, leading to a vigilante mentality. If they found him, there would likely be bloodshed. What about Ellie? How did she survive all this? Who knows? No one has seen her since Roger disappeared. You might need to ask her dad about that. Why would I do that? Oh, come on, Graham. I don't know what happened between you 2 years ago, but whatever it is, it seems like unfinished business. What do you mean? I asked, feeling a surge of emotion. Forget I even mentioned this woman. Just as quickly as she entered my office, Viria disappeared again for several days after our conversation. She kept avoiding my attempts to discuss her words. I must have forgotten about it because we had work to do, boring work, but there was plenty to keep me occupied. Most of my free time was spent meeting with my lawyers and worrying about my child custody case. I also tried to enjoy my time with young Ingrid and Agda, even though I was almost old enough to be their father. They wanted to counter Gloria's claim that I was a boring old stick in the mud. Despite my attempts to join in on their plans, I often had to disappoint them. I couldn't fathom how these two Swedish girls found so many charming English ladies, but their intentions became clear when I called them out for a chat. As Ingrid put it, the judge will be pleased to see you have a loving and caring stepmother willing to look after the children. I suspected Ingrid was right about this, but unfortunately, there was no spark between me and any of the women they introduced. When I say I was having fun, I don't mean staying out late at local nightclubs. I'm not much into opera or ballet, but I attended both, along with theater. I often found myself at proms at the Royal Albert Hall that autumn. I never understood how the girls got tickets to all these events. They must have been expensive, but they never shared that with me. I always covered travel, food, and drink expenses. It was the least I could do for two charming young ladies who tried to lift my spirits and keep my frustrations in check. Gloria and the man she was living with, whom she called her fiancé while still married to me, made it difficult to maintain a healthy relationship with my daughters. Technically, I had a temporary court order for access to the children 4 times a week, but Gloria and her partner's legal representatives constantly found ways to shorten these visits or bypass them entirely. It felt like their lawyers were part of a scheme, always ready with plausible excuses when my lawyers raised concerns. From the start, I was portrayed as a controlling workaholic who systematically neglected my wife and children, implying that I sought custody just to annoy their loving mother. If I had been smarter, I would have recorded every phone conversation with Gloria about my access, which might have shown the judge that it was she who kept changing the rules, not me. But by the time I realized it, it was already too late. To be honest, my behavior in the office probably worsened with each court hearing. The prospect of obtaining custody of the children felt increasingly unlikely, and to complicate matters, my new job had resulted in a healthier bank account for Gloria's lawyers to target, particularly regarding potential child support. On Wednesday morning, my life took a complete 180 degrees turn. The evening before, I had attended a concert with Ingrid and Agda and returned home quite late after dropping them off. Waking up at my usual time, I felt lazy and opted to have breakfast at a cafe, lingering there while reading the morning newspaper. As a result, it was 9 o'clock when I finally pulled into my office parking spot, where a rather irritated Viria and our secretary Christina were waiting. "Where have you been?" Viria exclaimed as she climbed into the front seat. "Everything's gone to hell. Your lawyer has been trying to reach you since last night." "What's happened?" "No time to explain. Sign this so the office can continue to operate today, and then we need to get to court before 10 o'clock. Your lawyer wanted you there by 9:30, but there's no way we'll make it now." For some reason, I always trusted Viria, so I signed the documents she offered without asking questions, even though I had no idea what I might be signing. Apparently satisfied that I had completed everything, she snatched the papers and handed them to Christina, who wished me luck as Viria slammed the door. "Okay, let's go to court," she urged. "Wait, what's going on?" "I don't know all the details, but one of the girls from your lawyer's office has been calling since dawn. She said you absolutely need to be in court before it opens today. Your case will be heard out of turn." "Why?" "I have no idea. But judging by her words, you might be able to take the children home with you from court today. That's why I came with you. Jerry Hartwell thought you'd need a woman by your side, to show you're ready for the kids to come home. Christina had wanted to come, but I insisted on going to keep things discreet. You don't need everyone in the office seeing your personal matters on display. Why did you have to show up at the last moment? You usually have coffee with me by 8:30. "I don't know, I got carried away with the newspaper after breakfast." We could use this time getting across town and finding a parking spot. At this hour, it won't be easy. Fortunately, we found a space not far from the courthouse and dashed the last few hundred meters to avoid the court's limited parking. Inside, we were quickly met by a young woman from my lawyer's office, who hurriedly escorted us through staircases and hallways I'd never seen before. We soon realized we had moved to the next building, where the family courts were located. Instead of a formal courtroom, we entered a large conference room where everyone sat around a substantial table, looking clearly impatient. "Please sit down, Mr. D. Sparks," commanded a stern-looking woman who turned out to be the family court judge. Judge Kroll was the same judge who had presided over Gloria and my divorce. In this courtroom, however, he seemed to take a back seat to the family court judge and her advisors. I still had no idea what was happening, but I noticed my lawyer was smirking at Gloria's lawyer. There was no sign of the usual attendants who were present at our meetings. The judge cleared her throat, drawing my attention back to her. I tried to silently ask my lawyer what was going on, but all he could do was grin at his professional opponent. "Mrs. Sparks," the judge began, "this report states that you and the children currently reside with Ronald Quinn. Is that correct?" "Yes," Gloria replied confidently. "And we plan to get married as soon as my divorce from Mr. Ted Sparks is finalized." "I see. And how long have you known Mr. Quinn?" "Some years." "I don't understand why this matters." "Oh, you might be surprised. Did you know Mr. Quinn's first wife?" "No, she died in Scotland before Ronald moved here." Very suddenly, the judge probed. Gloria's confidence began to wane. "It was an accident. Ronald was found not guilty in court." "Ah, but that's not the whole story, Mrs. Sparks. In Scotland, juries have a third option, not proven. This is an English family court, where we take a more flexible approach to evidence. Our first responsibility is the safety of the children. But Ronald wouldn't hurt the girls, he loves them." Gloria insisted. "He says so, Mrs. Sparks, but I'm also sure he claims to love you. If that's the case, please explain how you ended up with 3 broken ribs and 2 broken teeth last month." "Ronald would never intentionally harm me or the children." "I'm afraid Jennifer Quinn thought so too, Mrs. Sparks. She is now deceased, as are all 3 of her children. This court cannot risk a similar situation." "Okay, I won't marry Ronald. I'll find another place to live." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Sparks, but you showed poor judgment by moving the children in with Ronald Quinn. You made it worse by not holding him accountable for his actions. This court believes the safest course of action is to place the children in their father's custody." Gloria didn't give up, continuing to argue with the judge despite her lawyer's attempts to intervene until the judge threatened to have her removed from the courtroom. Then the judge turned to me. "Mr. D. Sparks, do you have adequate child care facilities?" Before I could respond, my lawyer jumped in. "Mr. Sparks still resides in the matrimonial home, where the children's bedrooms are ready for use. He also has 2 nannies known to the children who can move in immediately, along with another older nanny who is prepared to mentor them. Additionally, Mr. Sparks has Miss P here to assist if needed." "Do you have experience looking after children, Miss P?" the judge asked. "No, madam, but I have 5 younger siblings that I've helped care for since they were born," Varia answered. The judge looked at one of her advisors, who smiled and nodded. I noticed that the advisor and Varia seemed to share a connection. I later learned they were high school friends. From that point on, things became a bit more complicated, and I can't say exactly what happened because Gloria completely lost control of herself. She became hysterical, and her legal representative tried unsuccessfully to calm her down. For reasons I couldn't quite understand, I got up from my seat to help. I ended up having to calm Gloria down in the hallway, which was a strange situation given the circumstances. In the end, I was able to convince her that I wouldn't behave the way she did regarding our children. I assured her I wouldn't allow her boyfriend Quinn to have contact with them. When I returned to the courtroom, everything seemed to be wrapping up. The 2 lawyers appeared to be concluding their conversation with the judge overseeing the divorce. All the disputes and delays revolved around child custody, so I guess the family court judge's ruling had taken precedence. The divorce judge smiled at me as he left for his first case of the day, while Gloria's lawyer left looking disappointed. Well, we had everything covered, but that was a master stroke, my lawyer said as the judge exited. What was it? I asked, puzzled. I have no idea what happened here this morning. When did you find out about Quinn's past? We didn't. Your people found out. Didn't they tell you? That little act you did with Gloria really pleased the judge. Act? When I went to her, saying I wanted her to have a close relationship with the children? That wasn't an act. She's their mother. It would be wrong to keep them apart, regardless of how she treated me. Two wrongs don't make a right, Bernie reminded me. The judge said that if you do something stupid, it could come back to haunt you. Good point. But I won't let her get under my skin again. I'm not crazy, Bernie, I'm just trying to be generous. Gloria will be out of my life as soon as we finalize the divorce paperwork, but that doesn't mean I want to keep her away from our children if she can behave properly. Family court decisions on custody take precedence. I'd say the judge will sign the papers this afternoon. How did we end up here today? That report on Ronald Quinn that your people sent us yesterday. We took its contents to social services along with a few unsavory suggestions, and suddenly everything changed. Quinn was accused of a serious crime 15 years ago, but the Scottish jury returned a verdict of not proven, which is enough to raise red flags for local social workers. And there were those unexplained injuries to Gloria. How did you find out about that? It was all in the report that your people provided. I wish you had informed us about them, Graham. I didn't know who you were talking about. The only people working on my divorce were your team. Are you sure? Your team has extracted everything they could from me. Where would I get money for someone else? Your investigators should have handled all this. This report came from Thomas Associates. They're the best in the business. We wouldn't have entrusted you with such an expensive item. I never hired them, I replied. That's strange, Bernie said, flipping through a stack of papers. There are only the initials JH on these documents. Do you know who that is? Jerry Hartwell, Viria said, standing next to me. He's the director of human resources at the Goldberg Company. Well, he would have enough influence to engage Thomas Associates, Bernie remarked. Yes, but who's paying the bill? I asked. JH, Viria smiled and squeezed my hand. Looks like Jack Goldberg wants to keep you, Graham. I told you he doesn't hold a grudge against Canella. At that moment, a woman from social services approached us to explain where we could pick up the children. They were in a room just down the hall. Viria and I learned that after receiving the report, social services obtained an immediate court order and took the children into their care. Quinn had tried to prevent this and was currently in custody for assaulting a police officer, which explained his absence from family court. After introducing the children, who were delighted to see their dad, to Viria, who they instantly took a liking to, we headed toward the exit. On the way, I asked Bernie how he knew that Ingrid and Agda would be suitable nannies. He acted on instinct, Bernie replied. He met with Ingrid several times. She was a witness regarding Gloria's infidelity and expressed her desire to help care for the children if I won custody. I assumed Ingrid had also mentioned Agda. What about an experienced mentor? I asked. Both of these girls are studying childcare in addition to English. Their teacher rates them very highly. Have you talked to their teachers? Certainly. It's important to know everything before bringing a witness before a judge. Like, for example, the fact that Ronald Quinn has a troubling history. Oh, come on, Graham. Quinn covered his tracks well, with sealed court records. It takes organizations like Thomas Associates, which perform background checks for the government, to bypass those precautions. Okay, I forgive you. Now we need to get the kids home and settled. Luckily, the children were at an age where they had little understanding of the turmoil of the past 24 hours. They had been through a bit of trauma, but as soon as they saw their dog, their spirits lifted. The cat, however, was less pleased to see them and ran off into the garden. When they entered their old rooms, it felt as if they had never left. Of course, they asked several times where Mom was, and Viria and I skillfully avoided answering. Around 4 o'clock, a couple of people from Bernie's office arrived with the children's belongings. Social services had only given us 2 small suitcases from Quinn's house, claiming these were all that remained. I learned that Quinn had returned home from magistrate court to find Gloria preparing to leave, which he evidently didn't take well. There was enough noise between them that a neighbor called the police. Ultimately, Quinn was arrested again, allegedly for assaulting Gloria. She did not appear to have serious injuries when I met her a few days later to sign paperwork, suggesting the police may have acted to allow Gloria some space to move. Gloria had contacted her lawyers for advice on how to handle the children's belongings that she couldn't take with her. They then reached out to Bernie's office, prompting him to send a couple of assistants to collect the items and deliver them to me. I figured Gloria wouldn't want to go to Quinn's place to pick up their things after the kids returned home. Bernie later informed me, with a smile, that Gloria was temporarily staying with her sister. I got the impression she had persuaded a couple of his assistants to take her there on their way to my house. No wonder, Gloria had always been skilled at charming those around her. I planned to call Ingrid after she returned from college, but both girls showed up at my house shortly after the children's belongings arrived. Whether they were alerted by someone from Bernie's office or simply realized what was happening, I didn't know. Regardless, they immediately took charge of the children, allowing Viria to return to the office before it closed. We got the excited kids to bed before Viria returned, this time with her fiancé. I had never met him before but quickly realized Viria was the leader in their relationship. By the end of the evening, he expressed frustration that Viria was focused on her career and not in a hurry to marry or start a family. However, as the weeks passed and Viria continued to bring Tony around, he began to cheer up a bit, thinking the kids were preparing her for motherhood, though that was still a distant prospect. The next day, both girls moved into my home without much discussion. I learned that Bernie wasn't the only one who had suggested they could serve as the children's nannies if I won custody. There had to be 2 of them so one could stay home while the other attended college, taking partial courses. It's worth noting that I had to hire them as nannies. They were no longer living with me as a couple, but they had already done most of the housework since Gloria left. This arrangement allowed me to get to the office for a couple of hours the next day, where I was met with applause from my staff. I wasn't sure why I deserved such a welcome, but it seemed to be a show of support from my colleagues. Of course, I had to sign a mountain of documents again, trusting that Viria had read everything beforehand. After that, I approached Jerry Hartwell to discuss the report from Thomas Associates. "It's nothing to do with me," he said. "I'm just a small fry." "Are you saying Jack Goldberg ordered you to hire Thomas Associates?" "Not exactly. Graham, their routine background check on you was the basis for this report, but they were asked to conduct a more extensive investigation into your family and their connections, hoping it might help you. Jack approved the expenses, but you'll need to look elsewhere for the initiator." "Jerry, who is it?" I demanded. "No, Graham." "I'm sorry, but I was sworn to secrecy," he replied sternly, then smiled. "Tell me, who do you know that would have such influence over Jack Goldberg? Thomas Associates aren't cheap, and by the way, who recently went through a divorce?" "Ellie?" "I promise not to say that name." "Don't waste your time asking me questions again," Jerry chuckled. "You may see Jack as a miserable old man, but he's the first to admit his mistakes. I'd assume some unnamed person knew the moment you accepted the job offer at the company. To be completely honest, without naming names, a certain small fry knows exactly what's going on and often checks in on you. So, I should call her and thank her?" "Oh, God no. She'll kill me." Canella was adamantly opposed to me telling you that she. "What is she?" I pressed. "Come on, Graham, you can't be that clueless. Canella has a soft spot for you, a very weak one, I'd say. She made me promise to give you a heads up about how Thomas Associates found all this information on Quinn during their investigation into your background. But I thought it would be fairer to both of you if you understood how things worked. You're confusing me, Jerry." "Damn it, Graham. You're a nice guy going through a divorce with 2 little kids. Canella is a sweet young woman, also recently divorced, with 2 little ones. From what Viria told me, you and Canella were once a wonderful couple. I just wanted to let you know that Canella might be wondering if you're okay. Thanks for the heads up, Jerry, but everything that happened between me and Canella ended years ago. I'm not divorced yet, and I'm definitely not looking for a new wife. Not now, not ever. Please don't be offended, Graham. I was just trying to warn you. Canella used her influence with Jack to help you. I thought you should know. I'm not angry, Jerry, just confused. It's not like Canella has even stopped by since I started working here. She doesn't come around anymore, Graham. She's too ashamed that her husband almost destroyed the company. It's a shame. She was well received by everyone here. I doubt she'll miss any of Jack's social events now that she's no longer involved. Back at the office, I quickly went through everything with Varia before rushing home. I think I went home to check on the kids, but it turned out Ingrid and Agda had everything under control. The only issue was that the children kept asking where their mother was. Jerry had told me that Jack expected I would need a couple of weeks of flexibility in my work hours before returning to normal. They had confidence in Varia, possibly even more than I did. With the custody dispute nearly resolved, the divorce judge issued a decree later that week. The family court also established a temporary emergency solution to remove the children from Ronald Quinn. Technically, Gloria could have contested it, but her lack of action when Quinn first started abusing her didn't reflect well in the eyes of social workers. At our second family court meeting, updated reports from social services showed how well the children were settling in. They were officially released into my care, and I assumed Ingrid and Agda were subpoenaed to confirm my childcare plans in my and Gloria's absence. Bernie hinted that someone might suggest there was something questionable between me and one of the girls, but it didn't lead anywhere and probably didn't do that someone any favors in the judge's eyes. The topic of alimony was raised, though I hadn't requested any payments from Gloria. An order was made for her to pay me a small amount each month to set a precedent, should our circumstances change. I was making good money at the time, but Gloria was unemployed. She might find another wealthy fool, Bernie chuckled. Deep down, I had to admit I didn't particularly like Bernie, but then again, I'd never been fond of the legal profession. They always seemed more focused on finding ways to navigate around the law and making money than on the moral aspects of life. The court issued an order regarding Gloria's access to the children, specifying that she must have at least 2 hours with them at least 52 times a year. It was a peculiar order, and I struggled to understand it until one of Bernie's employees explained that there were concerns Gloria might try to take the children abroad, potentially escaping the jurisdiction of the British courts. Meanwhile, it came to my attention that Gloria had surprisingly built up a substantial bank balance. She had the means to run away with the children if given the chance. I learned she hadn't stayed with her sister for long before renting a nice apartment in the city and leasing an expensive car, which raised suspicions in Bernie's office about her intentions. I later discovered that Gloria had started working in a high-paying job shortly after leaving Quinn's house. Perhaps she was already in that line of work before we separated. I dismissed that thought as vindictive, but it could explain her sudden financial improvement. I would have preferred for Gloria to have more access to the children than the court mandated, but after the initial weeks when she visited almost daily, her visits dwindled. At the time, I assumed she had found someone new. The children quickly adjusted to Gloria's absence, though they would get upset if Ingrid or Agda weren't around for more than a few days. Eventually, we all flew to Sweden for a week just before Christmas so the girls could visit their families. Agda's parents and Ingrid's father visited me several times while in London, although I never met Ingrid's mother or her boyfriend. I missed the company's Christmas party, but when I returned, Varia mentioned that Canella had attended, much to everyone's delight. Oh my God, Graham, it was like royalty walked in. Everyone applauded, and poor Canella looked so embarrassed. I think they were all just trying to show her they still cared, Varia said. Jerry introduced her to our table, and she congratulated us on our engagement. She seemed to be looking for someone at our table until Jerry informed her I was in Sweden, which visibly disappointed her. Tony danced with her afterward and mentioned she asked about me and the kids. He suspected she knew we often had the girls over. Gloria stopped by early on Christmas morning with gifts for the children but declined our invitation for Christmas dinner, indicating she had other plans. I assumed it was with someone new, though looking back, it might have been a client. At the start of the new year, Jack Goldberg and his wife invited Varia and me, along with a guest each, to a cocktail party at their home. It was an invitation we couldn't refuse, though I was hesitant about who to bring. After discussing potential candidates, Tony suggested he stay home while Varia and I attended together. I often went out with one of the girls in the evenings, mainly to the theater, but this time felt different. During that period, I spotted Gloria a couple of times with one of her clients. It was quite awkward, and I thought it was just her boyfriend I had spotted. I can't say cocktail parties are my thing. This was the first big one I had ever attended. Thankfully, Varia's parents were also invited, so I spent a lot of time chatting with them after we were introduced. It seemed the general consensus was that Varia was starting to show interest in my children, which was why she had finally set a wedding date with Tony. Varia knew nearly everyone there, having grown up in this social circle. Her father was a member of the same golf club as Jack Goldberg. As the evening progressed, she often slipped away to catch up with friends, leaving me to converse with her parents. There was some confusion about why Varia had come with me instead of Tony, a detail we hadn't really considered beforehand. Then, unexpectedly, I encountered Mrs. Jack Goldberg, who took me by surprise and further confused everyone. She instinctively called me Sparky and smiled, something I had never seen from her before. "We've known Sparky for years," she explained to the curious crowd. "You wouldn't recognize him as the young man we once knew. At one point, we thought he could become our son-in-law." I couldn't believe the pleasant demeanor on her face, which made me realize it was time to excuse myself before saying something regrettable. On my way back from the restroom, I bumped into a waitress and grabbed another drink when I heard the familiar nickname again. "Hi, Sparky. How's Bonnie? Still riding her?" Bonnie was the name I'd given my old Triumph, so I turned to see Ellie behind me. "Hey, Ellie. Long time no see." "Bonnie went to the great junkyard in the sky years ago," I replied. "How are you?" I felt a bit foolish asking, but it was better than saying what I was really thinking, that she looked stunning. "Not great, Sparky. You've probably heard what my husband did and what my wife did to me. We're on equal footing now, I guess," she said. "So are we going to stand here and wallow in our misfortunes, or can we forget those scoundrels as if they never existed? What happened has happened. There's no point in crying over spilled milk," I replied. I try to move on and focus on the good times. Ellie grew serious for a moment. "She didn't forget, Sparky. She's heard stories about other women with Bonnie. I can assure you, it didn't end well." "Seems you're listening to the wrong storytellers," I countered. "But I think I should head back to Varia. Can I join you? I don't like being alone at these events. Just remember, my name is now Graham Sparks." Of course, Mr. Graham Sparks, manager of the accounting department, very well regarded, I hear. As we walked back, Ellie slipped her hand into mine, and I noticed some people looking at us. They seemed puzzled since I had come with Varia, whose upcoming wedding to Tony had recently been announced. Ellie kept chatting about people we knew and places we'd visited together, even mentioning a couple of spots where we used to park. When we returned, Varia greeted us with a smile. "Hey, they're dancing in the other room. Shall we go join them?" "Join them? It will be great," Ellie said before I could respond. Suddenly, I found myself with Ellie on one arm and Varia on the other, being led into a room where a small band was playing. "You first," Ellie joked, handing my drink to Varia. "Can't I say anything?" I protested. "No," both women replied in unison. "He hates formal dancing," Varia added. "Oh, he's better than before, I assure you," Ellie said. "How do you know?" I asked, trying to prove I could still speak for myself. "Ingrid and Agda told me you danced well in Stockholm," she replied. "I need to fire those girls, they talk too much," I joked as Varia guided me onto the dance floor. "Oh, let me know if you do. I really need a good nanny for my girls," Ellie laughed as we moved away from her. "What are you doing?" I asked Varia when she finally came into my arms to dance. "I'm just trying to show everyone what a good dancer you've become," she replied. "Stop doing that, you know what I mean." Ellie was watching us, and I could sense a change in her mood. It seemed like something had shifted in her thoughts. "Graham, as you've often said, I don't know what went wrong between you and Canella, but I know she regrets it, and deep down, I believe you do too. She's trying her best to help you, and even her mother, whom you always described as a complete vixen, has nice things to say about you. You should at least give Canella a chance." "Yes, you should," Viria added. The conversation continued like this throughout the dance, which felt more like an argument than anything else. As we swayed, I noticed several young men approaching Ellie, presumably to ask her to dance, but she declined. I should have taken it as a compliment, but I couldn't shake my nerves. I managed to take a sip of my drink before Viria took it from me, and Ellie pulled me back onto the dance floor. It quickly became clear that Ellie was quite nervous, and her chatter resumed as soon as we left Viria's side. "Please relax, Ellie. Whatever happened years ago, it wasn't our fault. We were young, and these things happen. Let's leave the past behind us. Tell me about your children." For the rest of the evening, whether we were dancing or not, we talked about our kids and how we coped with parenting alone. Surprisingly, our children were almost the same age, and all girls. I realized Ellie's mother provided her with daily support when she wasn't busy with her charities. "What I hate most is being alone at night," Ellie confessed. I agreed but couldn't help but think that she was referring to a different kind of loneliness than I was. Like most men, I longed for companionship at night, but I let that moment pass. It was clear that Ellie knew a lot about my situation at home. I wondered just how much more she was aware of, likely including the details from Thomas's report. I didn't thank her for persuading her father to approve the expense for that report. I figured we could discuss that privately later. Viria and I planned to leave around 12:30 a.m., the time we had agreed Tony would pick us up. As we were getting ready to put on our coats, one of Jack Goldberg's assistants approached us with the news that Tony's car had broken down, and we would need to call a taxi. But Ellie wouldn't hear of it. She insisted on driving us home herself. "I don't want to take you away from your parents' party," I protested. "You weren't afraid of my ride before, Graham. Why are you now?" Ellie smiled. "Besides, I have to get back to my kids. I only have a young neighbor looking after them. Good nannies are hard to find where I live." Her urgency to return to her children seemed to fade as soon as we got into her car. She drove first to where Tony had broken down, arriving just as the tow truck did. Then she took us to Viria's parents' house, where I assumed Tony would stay the night. Finally, around 2 a.m., we arrived at my house. For some inexplicable reason, I invited Ellie in to meet Ingrid and Agda, who were looking out the living room window as we pulled up. Ellie refused, saying she really had to get back to her children, but she would accept the invitation another time because she wanted to meet the two young ladies Viria had talked so much about. 2 evenings later, I came home from the office to find Ellie's car in my driveway and Gloria's car parked on the street. I expected Gloria to be there, but not Ellie and her 2 children. It was actually quite enjoyable. When I peeked into the living room, I saw that Pamela was much more interested in her new friend Simone than in her mother. Although Deborah was sitting on Gloria's lap, her attention was directed toward the little stranger Ingrid was holding. Ellie and Agda were in the kitchen making tea when I entered. "Sorry, Graham, looks like I picked a bad day to come by," Ellie said with a smile and a wink when she saw me in the doorway. All I had time to say was, "Don't worry, Ellie," before I noticed Agda making all sorts of gestures at me, nodding toward the living room where Ingrid, Gloria, and the kids were. I couldn't understand the pantomime and showed my confusion. Agda finally pulled me into the kitchen, closed the door, and grinned. "Mrs. Sparks doesn't know who Miss Ellie is. She's trying to ask without asking. It's quite funny to watch." I realized I was missing out on some fun. Ellie had happened to be in the area and stopped by to introduce herself to Ingrid and Agda, then brought her children to meet mine. Just then, Gloria arrived, and the 3 women conspired to play a little game with her. They were intentionally vague about Ellie's identity, leaving out her last name. When Gloria finally asked directly, Ellie replied that she was an old and very close friend. Gloria seemed stunned by this revelation and kept trying to figure out where Ellie and I had met and how long we had known each other. The 3 conspirators dodged her questions, which made the situation even more amusing. As we brought the tea and coffee that Agda and Ellie had prepared into the living room, I noticed Gloria was clearly upset about Ellie's presence. I watched with amusement as her curiosity turned to disappointment. Gloria likely couldn't believe there was any chance for reconciliation after how she had behaved, and she probably didn't like the idea of me finding someone else to share my life with. Honestly, at that moment, I didn't think there would be a romantic connection between Ellie and me, despite Viria's encouragement. I had once been infatuated with Ellie and had gotten burned. I could see us as friends, maybe even close friends, but romance felt unlikely. Ellie was the first to get up to leave, and I suspected Gloria had subtly encouraged it. As I walked Ellie and her kids to the car, she asked if I had dinner plans for the next night. "I'll be with the children. Ingrid and Agda have a double date, and they believe in the safety in numbers rule," Ellie said with a laugh. "Bring the kids to dinner, it'll be fine. Deborah will go to bed early. We can put her in the travel crib I have, and if it gets too late, Pamela can lie down with Simone. They seem to get along well." "Oh, don't worry, I'm not going to jump you," Ellie added with a smile. "I just don't like being alone every evening. It would be nice to sit and talk about old times and clear up some misunderstandings." As I leaned in to give Ellie a quick kiss on the cheek before she got in the car, she glanced back at the living room window. "Graham, lean over and kiss me before I leave." "Wait, what about?" "Don't look so confused, honey. Just smile and kiss me. I'll call you at the office tomorrow." I did as she asked, and she sped off, honking her horn as she left. When I returned to the house, Gloria was waiting by the door. "Who is this woman?" she demanded. "Just an old friend," I replied with a grin. "How long have you known her? And who was that little girl you were in court with?" "That girl is Veronica, actually Viria, and she's not a little girl. I think you've confused her with yourself. Viria is a work colleague and a good friend who has supported me a lot over the past months. She's getting married soon, and your eldest daughter will be one of her bridesmaids. Deborah is too young to understand, but she'll be dressed for the occasion, too." Gloria responded, then added, "Well, who is this Ellie, and how well do you know her?" "I know Ellie much better than I ever knew you," I said, feeling the tension rise. "What does that mean? That I knew Ellie long before I slept with you for the first time? Now good night, Gloria. I have things to do this evening." I practically pushed her out the door. "You told her everything?" Ingrid asked. "Yes, I saw no reason not to. Sooner or later, one of Gloria's friends will put two and two together." "No, I mean about Viria," Ingrid pressed. "Why shouldn't I have told her about Viria?" I replied, noticing both Ingrid and Agda suddenly looking very embarrassed. "What did you two tell Gloria?" I demanded. "We didn't say anything," Ingrid blurted out. "What could a 4-year-old girl tell Gloria?" I replied. "Not much, but when Gloria asked, Pamela said that Viria is your girlfriend," Ingrid admitted. "Oops," I grinned at the girls. "And you didn't think to correct that misunderstanding?" "Well, not quite," Ingrid replied. "My mother always hated it when my father went out with other women. We thought Gloria's imagination deserved to think whatever she wanted about the situation." "Oh, I see," I said, now understanding. "But Pamela never mentioned that Tony sometimes sits with them when I take you two out," Agda added with a smile. "That's very clever of you," I admitted. Now Gloria is trying to figure out where Ellie fits into this. "I wish I had told her that Viria is getting married next month," Ingrid said. "Why didn't you say who she's marrying?" I asked. "Of course we could hint," Ingrid grinned. "She'll probably ask us." "Don't you dare. My life is complicated enough as it is, and besides, Gloria is already frustrated trying to figure out who Ellie is." I wasn't in the office when Ellie called the next morning. When I returned, I found Viria sitting at my desk, talking on the phone. We had decided to share an office a few weeks ago because it made things easier for both of us. "Don't worry," I talked to the girls. "They'll pack everything the children need." "They're very good," Viria said, waving as she poured herself coffee from the pot we kept in the office. "Listen, Cannell, I'm sure one of them would be happy to come over with Graham and watch the kids if you want to go out tonight. And if they can't, Tony and I can always babysit unless we have other plans." Viria smiled at me as I placed her coffee on my table. "Oh, he looks at me with such suspicion because I'm arranging his love life again," she joked. "What did Ellie say?" I demanded. When Viria stopped laughing to catch her breath, she said, "We're talking about you, honey, not to you." Then she turned her attention back to Ellie on the phone. Hey, Sparky! Are you ready for tonight? It seems like everything was planned behind your back. Not on purpose. You sounded a little off last night, so I invited Viria and her boyfriend, too. But apparently, they're tied up tonight. This is news to me, I replied. Anyway, I'll be waiting for you and the kids around 6:30, okay? Wait, Ellie. Our company has a management meeting every Friday evening. I'm not sure we can get there that early. You forgot that I know how the company works, Graham. Viria will tell you that the meeting was rescheduled because my father had something very important come up that evening. You didn't ask him to reschedule just so I could dine with the boss's daughter, I protested. But don't worry. Dad won't reveal why he rescheduled. He can be very discreet when he wants to be. And as you can guess, he approves of our communication. By the way, so does Mom. I glanced at Viria and asked, am I being forced into this? No. I told you the other day that I just want us to be friends, Ellie responded quickly, while Viria shook her head furiously. Okay, I'll try to be there by 5:30 unless you tell me where you live. Viria has the address and directions. See you tonight, Sparky, Ellie said before the line disconnected, but I caught her laughter before it ended. How long did you talk to Ellie before I got back? I asked Viria. Long enough. Ingrid called earlier to discuss the evening's plans, she explained. I later learned that when my two nannies went out without their father, it was usually either Viria or Tony who acted as chaperones. The girls had agreed to be in the same place as Viria and Tony that evening and followed their cars home just in case. I also discovered that most, if not all, of the women my nannies tried to find for me had been secretly vetted by Viria. I'm still being forced into this, I insisted when Viria finished her explanation. Nothing like that, Graham. We're just trying to give you some kind of social life back. You only leave the house to work or take the kids out, and when I go out with you and Tony, it's like you're a third wheel. You need to have your own life, Graham. Canella is perfect for you, you're both in similar situations. No one expects you to fall head over heels in love, but you both understand each other's circumstances better than most. I knew the women around me were trying to influence my decisions, well, almost all of them. Gloria was definitely not part of their plans. Our evening at Ellie's house was pleasant and different from any I'd had recently. It wasn't just about Ellie and me, as some might think, it revolved around us and the kids. Although the younger ones went to bed early, Ellie and I played games with the older children until they finally settled down. Later, after the kids were asleep, Ellie and I sat in her living room reminiscing about old times. We eventually reached a point in our relationship where we had lost touch. It turned out that some of Ellie's friends had convinced her I was pursuing others. When specific names came up, I realized those same friends were the ones who had been trying to get my attention at the time. Reflecting on those days, I couldn't help but chuckle. Surprisingly, given how much time had passed, Ellie and I found humor in our shared history. When we mentioned names, Ellie was not at all shocked that some had betrayed her trust. It was a light-hearted evening, and I sensed we would definitely do it again. Oh, and just to clarify, Ellie and I didn't get overly sentimental during our game night. After the kids went to bed, we sat across from each other on separate couches, with a coffee table between us. We discussed how my visit was aimed at reviving our friendship rather than anything romantic. I lost track of time, but I must have gone to bed around 2 or 3 a.m. I was still asleep when Pamela came in, asking me to join everyone for breakfast around 9 a.m. I was surprised the kids hadn't woken me earlier, especially since Ingrid and Agda weren't there to supervise. I quickly showered and dressed, rushing downstairs to apologize to Ellie for sleeping in. When I entered the kitchen, I found Ellie was not managing alone. Ingrid and Agda were sitting at the table with her, enjoying coffee. It was clear they didn't trust me to handle the kids on my own, so they had persuaded Tony and Viria to bring them over that morning. Viria and Tony had stayed over at my house many times in the past while babysitting Pamela and Deborah. It turned out our day was already planned out, and while I had vetoed the trip to the London Zoo, I suggested we go to the larger zoo at Whipsnade instead. I probably chose it because I hadn't been there since I took Ellie years ago. With 8 of us, we needed 2 cars. Ingrid, Pamela, Simone, and I went in mine, while the younger kids and Agda rode with Ellie. Throughout the day, the kids switched between cars multiple times, and while the journey to Whipsnade was lengthy, they were eager to see every animal. After a full day, we returned to my house around 7 p.m., and Pamela and Deborah fell asleep almost immediately. They must have been as exhausted as I was. Ingrid and Agda, on the other hand, looked fresh as they settled in front of the TV. I lingered for a bit, trying to appear alert, but eventually, I headed off to bed myself. It was almost lunchtime on a Tuesday morning when a sudden rise in voices in the shared office distracted Virya and me from our computer screens. Before I could open the door to see what was happening, Virya turned to me with a smile. "It's Kella," she said, then disappeared, closing the door behind her and calling out, "Hello, stranger." Left to decide whether to follow her or wait for Ellie to come to my office, I contemplated my options for a few moments. I didn't want to seem too eager, if you know what I mean. Eventually, I decided it was best to go. After all, Kella was the boss's daughter, and it felt more appropriate to address her as Canella in front of the employees. As it turned out, going there was a mistake. Ellie moved slowly through the office, and everyone seemed eager to greet her. I was almost in line to say hello when some of them noticed me and decided to return to their tasks instead. Virya poured coffee for the three of us as Ellie explained that she was just stopping by to drop off a purse Agda had left in her car on Saturday. I was surprised that Agda could forget such an important accessory, especially since it held all her cosmetics. Both she and Ingrid were always so careful about their appearance. It felt odd that Agda hadn't mentioned it, but I suspected I knew what was going on. Virya later suggested that Ellie's visit might have been her excuse to return to the office. Ellie spent most of that morning in my office, chatting with Virya about the children's trip to Whipsnade. I left them to talk while I got back to work. Since Virya and I often had lunch together, when she invited Ellie along, it felt like a given that we would all eat together. As we left the office, Jack and his small entourage appeared out of nowhere and somehow invited us to join them for lunch. We ended up at Jack's usual expensive restaurant, and to my delight, it seemed the company was picking up the tab. Virya, Ellie, and I didn't have much chance to speak privately. On the way back to the office, Jerry Hartwell approached me, expressing how happy everyone was that Ellie was back in the office. I was given some credit for her return, but I barely listened because I overheard Virya saying to Ellie, "Oh, of course he doesn't mind. He told me yesterday how much the girls enjoyed playing with your two over the weekend. Just bring them when it gets too much, Ingrid and Agda won't mind either." Ellie left the group in the company parking lot, mentioning something about needing to pick up her children. I didn't quite catch where the comment came from, but I assumed it was about the nanny. "Tell me, Virya, who wouldn't mind if Ellie brought her girls over to play with his kids?" I asked her when we were alone in our office. "You, of course." "Why me?" "Oh, don't be silly, Graham. It's your fault that Simone can't play with her best friend anymore." "My fault? How's that?" "Well, let's see how Canella tells it." "Ellie, you mean? Why do you insist on calling her Canella?" "Trust me, there's only one person who allows anyone to call her Ellie. Have you noticed that?" "I can't say I have." "Trust me." Anyway, the way she tells the story, you and she were reminiscing about old times on Friday night. "What did she tell you?" "Nothing more than what you shared with me long ago, so don't worry." "Oh God, I really told you, didn't I?" "Yeah, I guess that's what happens when you talk too much. It's not your usual trait." Anyway, Canella hinted that some of her friends gave you the impression that she was leading you on back then. We kind of figured that out the other day, and one of them definitely took advantage of the situation that the story created. "Yeah, well, I dated a couple of Ellie's friends after she moved away. The idea of you being led on was a complete fabrication, and it turns out that one of those women who fed you that nonsense is the mother of Simone's best friend. By the way, she was also one of Canella's closest friends before last Friday night, or rather Sunday morning, when Canella rebuffed her. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when we start lying. Oh my God, you're quoting Sir Walter Scott. Quietly studying the classics, huh? No, not really. Mary Williams, my old teacher, gave me a book of useful quotes when I left school. I studied it for several weeks. Mary said it would make me sound smart even if I didn't look like one. Back then, I was all leather jackets and long hair. Anyway, I think this is the first time I've found an opportunity to use one of Mary's quotes. I remember her, a nice old lady who used to come to my dad's cocktail parties with Bill Gillard. I think she and Bill were quiet lovers, or at least they were once. I wonder why they never got married. I don't know, but that explains a lot about why I got the job in the accounting office. I wasn't exactly a natural candidate for an office job back then, more suited for a construction job. Mary Williams encouraged me to apply with Bill, and he set me on the path to further education. You didn't know they were involved? Not a single child in that school would have believed it. Mary was kind, but she could be quite formidable when she wanted. What about Kella? Do you still have the courage to pursue something with her? Well, I'm sure that's what she wants, but Viria, Ellie and I had something good once, a long time ago. I work for her father now, and I really don't want to complicate things. If Ellie wants to be friends, I'm more than happy to keep it that way, but I don't see it going further. Fine, but trust me, Canella will get her way, and you'll end up closer than you think. In the following months, Ellie did bring her children to my house to play with mine, mostly while I was at work. Often, they were still there when I returned. During school holidays, she would come during the day to pick up Ingrid, Agda, and my girls, so they could all spend time together. I even bought a minivan to accommodate everyone. Ellie never mentioned Tanya or why they had a falling out, and she didn't encourage Simone's friendship with her daughter, though I sometimes heard Simone mention Pamela's baby. One day, I decided I needed to bring it up with Ellie, so I caught her in the kitchen. Listen, Ellie, what do you think about parents who don't let their children make friends like ours did? I know what you mean, Graham, but this is different. Our parents didn't approve of our friendships. We found a way to communicate despite that. What Tanya did to us is entirely different. She separated us for her own reasons. Did you tell her how it was for us? I never said it outright, but it was clear from how we interacted. God, I was so naive, thinking I could talk about how good we were together without any repercussions. Why didn't anyone tell me this before? They did, but I thought it was exaggerated. It's just the nonsense people say about relationships. Is that all it meant to you? A short affair? Ellie sounded upset. Hey, don't get me wrong. I was in love with you, it wasn't just a fling. I agree that things were a bit awkward, but I truly cared about you at the time. With Tanya and the others, I can see how that could be viewed as just a short affair. 8 months, Graham. You waited for me for 8 months? To be honest, it was only 4 months after your last letter before I started to move on. I thought you were seeing someone else less than 2 weeks after I left. I was a fool for believing my so-called friends over you. But there's no point in dwelling on it now. What does that mean? You stopped loving me a long time ago, didn't you? Maybe I have, but I'm glad we can still be friends. You're noble for that. You're manipulating this conversation, aren't you? I don't know what you're talking about, Graham. I suspect I should be saying I want to be more than friends. Is that what you want? It depends on whether you've thought about it. Thought about what? About spending some time together again. Where is this conversation going? To the bedroom, I hope. Now, which one is yours or mine? Neither. I work for your father, remember? Do you really think you would dare interfere in my personal life again after what happened with Ronald? Why not? Ronald was the perfect husband for me, according to Dad. In the old days, Sparky was my parents' nightmare. They've since admitted they saw the error in their ways. I don't think he'll interfere with us in the future. We can keep things informal or make them formal, but whatever happens, how about you and I try out the back seat of one of our cars sometime? I get excited every time I see you. No, we didn't act on it that night, but Ellie's children stayed with me for the weekend while Ingrid and Agda looked after them. Ellie and I went for a romantic dinner, after which we checked into one of the best hotels in the area. Why a hotel, you ask? Why not go back to Ellie's house? Well, we needed new beds before anything could happen. I couldn't share the same bed with Ellie that I once shared with Gloria. It just didn't feel right, and we faced the same issue at Ellie's with Ronald. So, our first experience together again required a large bed in the hotel suite. I can't explain what it meant to take Ellie to dinner or how challenging it was to get her out of the car at the restaurant. Then it got amusing because Ellie insisted we check into the hotel as Mr. Tay and Mrs. Smith. The front desk clerk greeted her with, "Good evening, Miss Goldberg," when she signed the register as G. Smith. I wanted a drink at the bar, but Ellie was eager to get to our room. We giggled like schoolchildren all the way to our room, where Ellie insisted I carry her over the threshold. By then, I was completely swept up in her enthusiasm. I won't describe what happened in the room that night. A gentleman doesn't discuss such things in public. Suffice it to say, Ellie stood by me and suggested I spend less time at my desk and more time taking care of myself. "I can't find time to go to the gym," I complained. "Who's talking about the gym? I'm offering you a workout every night of the week for free," she smiled. "Oh my, you little devil." When I walked into the office on Monday morning, Vern greeted me. "Damn, what did you do? Grow horns over the weekend?" "No, you don't have the look of an abandoned man anymore," she smiled. I might not have noticed if Tony and I hadn't stopped by Saturday night and found the girls putting all 4 kids to bed. It was funny when we asked when you plan to come home. Simone said that Mom and Dad need time alone, so they probably won't be back until Sunday lunch at the earliest. She's only 5 years old. Oh, come on. She won't know what you two actually did. What's more telling is that she calls you Daddy. Ellie and the girls picked that up from Pamela and Deborah, who started calling her Mom a few weeks ago. Well, you're going to be their legal stepfather. Look, don't get ahead of yourself, Viria. I'm not sure what the future holds. There are a lot of things to consider, Ingrid and Agda, for instance. The kids are very attached to them, as they are to their supposed step-siblings too. All you need to do is look at the big picture. Canella is trying to raise 4 small children every morning. If that doesn't require a nanny or 2 in the house, I don't know what does. And Canella's huge mansion is full of spare rooms. You've planned everything for us, haven't you? Not really, but it seems like a logical progression. You two are dating again after many years, both in similar situations raising kids on your own, and more importantly, you're crazy about each other. Plus, you're extremely compatible. What makes you think Saturday night wasn't a disaster? You were expected to return Sunday morning, yet you didn't show up until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Ingrid was worried and doesn't have the same confidence in your romantic skills that I do. I know Saturday night wasn't a failure. This will likely become a regular thing until you two either move in together or get married. I believed I could ask Viria not to interfere in my personal affairs, but I knew in advance that it would be a futile effort. The kids and I are at Canella's house. Can you pick us up today? Ingrid asked when she called just after lunch. Sure. The kids are having fun. Wait a minute, isn't Pamela supposed to be in kindergarten today? She was, but not in a regular daycare. We thought it would be a good idea to see how Pamela would react to going to school here. She likes it because Simone is with her. Are we getting ahead of ourselves, Ingrid? You think so? But I don't, Graham. There just aren't enough bedrooms in your house. We thought it would be smart to see how Pamela and Deborah would adapt to changing schools. Deborah likes the daycare here too. Well, it seems like that's all settled. My extended family moved into Canella's house in a matter of days, and yes, we had to buy a new double bed pretty quickly. Where exactly did Canella rent the vintage Vauxhall Viva? I have no idea, but we did go to the lake one night for old time's sake. It was an interesting night, though I felt the effects for days afterward. The second time we tried it was in Jack Goldberg's limousine, much more space and a much more memorable experience for both of us. I still wonder if he ever realized why Canella borrowed his beloved car that night. A year or so later, I became the company's CFO, and a few years after that, Jack retired, and I jumped straight into the chairman's chair. Ingrid and Agda? Well, Ingrid still lives with us as a kind of guest or foster sister. Agda married a nice young guy from our office. She really took the initiative there. They seem happy, and apparently, he now speaks Swedish like a native. Viria and Tony are married, and she claims she enjoys her high-profile job as CFO. She's assisted part-time by Canella Sparks, but I'm not entirely sure how much of their time together is related to work. Tony and I both believe that the two important women in our lives spend most of their time shopping and attending fashion shows. As for me, I spend most of my time in my office upstairs, managing the team. In fact, I'm enjoying getting older. Life goes on. What do you think of our story today? I think that the nanny they hired is good, because she subtly hinted to him about his wife's infidelity, and it's right, it should be reported somehow. What's your impression of the story? Write in the comments. See you in the comments.